Nihanyang, hello, I am the Dark Fae, and welcome back to Confessions of a First-Time Dungeon Master. As always, if you missed the last session, I'll put a link to it up in the corner for you over here. You can go check it out, catch up on what you missed, then come back here to find out what happened next. We are now on session, I want to say 49, so let's begin. Okay, so we started off with combat. We rolled initiative at the end of the last session, and the frostworm had just let out its sort of stunning trill. So 4 people, again, are stunned, and only Puck and Umric are free to do their actions. Luckily, Umric is early in the initiative before the frostworm, so he casts Banishment on the worm, and Banishment, I feel like, is like a time-honored D&D spell that requires a charisma save. Frostworms, large giant creatures, not very charismatic, so it fails its save, luckily, and they have like a minute to kind of try and get out of this stun. The lower DC, it's not too bad. It only takes a couple of rounds until everyone is free of it. And luckily, with the Frostworm's ability, the Trill, once they save from it, they are immune to it for another 24 hours. So that, props to Umric, that's actually a very good thing that he was able to banish it and basically render its Trill useless, because if they're stunned and it starts biting them, they get eaten real quick. So more on that later. But so during the minute, I go round by round just in the beginning to see when they all kind of save from the stun, and then we kind of go into a little bit of non-combat based terms, I guess. So they spend most of their time kind of either deciding, not really deciding whether or not they want to run, but they explore the cavern. And I mentioned, because Umric is pretty high passive perception and rolled a pretty high perception check, that the wall to the north side of this cavern, it's not as opaque as maybe the tunnel walls that they have seen before. Like, there's not light shining behind it, but it is noticeably thinner than the kind of unbreakable, like, tunnel walls that have been surrounding them this whole time. So they kind of try to smash through it, break through it. It is still like a solid block of ice. It's going to take something much heavier, or it's going to take a much longer time if they want to bust through it. Like, it's gonna take more than a minute of just like smashing away with a hammer, or even trying to melt it to make like a tunnel that's big enough for them to go through. So they spend some time doing that, and then they're all in the cavern and decide to stay and fight the worm. In my mind, totally should have run, because well, I know at least the frostworm is probably like the worst encounter that they could have found in this cavern. It's the toughest thing. Well, it's probably the one that hits the hardest. It's a bit different since there's only one of the worms versus 6 of them, but it's the biggest, it's kind of the baddest, and it can eat them, which is not a good time. So, if they were to run from any combat, I would have thought it would be this one. It's not. They decide to fight the huge worm. Worms in D&D, generally not very easy to fight, or not a lot of fun to fight anyways. So, combat begins. It's kind of funny, some of them don't quite remember where the worm disappeared from, so their positioning's a little bit off. But Puck kind of starts off with casting Avara's Black Tentacles once again, as in the last combat they did. And giant worms, not very dexterous, can't really avoid a kind of giant square of writhing tentacles, so it becomes restrained. They do get in some good hits at range when it's restrained. They do realize that it is vulnerable to it's vulnerable to fire damage. Couple of them do still get into melee with it, which lets it bite. Some very lucky saves in that they rolled a high enough dex save that they don't get swallowed, because for every bite they have to roll a DC. I made it a 17. It's ordinarily like a 20 something, I think. Dexterity saving throw or be swallowed. And when swallowed, blind, restrained, and at the top of the worm's turns, I think it is a combination of acid and cold damage, which is not a fun time if you've already suffered a bite, because the bite does quite a lot of piercing damage and also cold damage. So, a couple of them do have cold resistance thanks to the magic items that I sort of gave them. Bavron drinks one of the cold resistant potions, which is good for him. So combat's going. After the worm has been hit with some kind of fire damage, it then uses its action to break free of the restraint, and it actually tunnels downwards into the ice, getting a good 30-40 feet into the ice, making a tunnel. And it's always the question, right, of whether you jump in the tunnel to follow or not. Everyone's kind of saying, nope, this is not the time. You do not follow worms or burrowing creatures into the tunnels they make. But Ivar, who I don't know if he's been really paying attention during this combat. Mine is on his turn, and this is a bit of a peeve of mine when players, whether I'm DMing or not, are only paying attention during their turn. I understand that yes, it can get boring or it's not very interesting to listen to what other players are doing, but it's kind of important, especially to know who's injured, where everyone is, what the status is on everyone, and what the status of the enemy is. I feel like after some practice, and if you're really invested in the game, it's not that bad of a chore to just pay attention. But so he wants to follow the worm into the tunnel. The tunnel that the worm made is directly below where it was sitting, within a bonfire, or underneath a bonfire now, and also within this mass of Ivar's black tentacles. So he says, I'm going to follow the worm. And he goes into the square that's clearly drawn on the map. And I have done a lot of letting them retcon things and be like, no, I want to do this instead. So I think in cases like this where they're like, I'm going to do it, it's warranted for me to be like, okay, roll a dexterity save as you walk into this writhing pile of tentacles. He fails, is restrained, and then loses the rest of his turn. So, he's now restrained in the Warlock's spell. And we were laughing a bit, because I was kind of spinning things to be like, and Puck's tentacles, do it again, kind of ribbing him a bit for being the cause of Ivar's death earlier in the game. But this time, it's 100% not his fault. I don't know. But then everyone's kind of holding their attacks, trying to get into a more advantageous position. And then it's the worm's turn. So the worm, large enough that it can kind of reach anybody there and spring up an attack. So I number them 1 through 6, I roll a dice twice to see who it's going to hit. It happens to roll where, for Ivar and Umric, who it can both reach. Like, if it came up in one square, it's big enough that they would be kind of on two sides of the worm and it could attack both without needing to expend more movement. So, because Ivar is restrained, advantage on the attack, it's Ivar auto fails death saves, is swallowed. Yeah, it's not great. And to get out, you have to do enough damage to it in order for it to fail. A DC, I think 20 con save. I lowered the, I think I lowered the DC. No, I didn't. Either way, DC 20 or 25 con save in order to, like, not regurgitate them. So then at which point, Basil decides to charm monster, which is a wisdom save. Worms don't have very good wisdom. The worm fails, and so it's charmed. And Basil tells him to drop it, like spit it out. Still a bit on tenterhooks as to whether or not the worm would understand him. Like, charm, yes, but like, you're trying to socially interact with a worm that has an intelligence of 1. So at that point, it would be either like animal handling. Like, I don't really think it'd be persuasion because it can't understand. But anyways, moot point, because after that, Ivar, who, again, I don't think he pays attention, but this would also be, like, technically what his character would know, because his character would have no idea that the worm is charmed. So I guess in this way he didn't metagame, which is good. But he attacks it from the inside, attempting to cast Chromatic Orb. And again, there's that whole thing of like, I'm inside the creature, but you're blind and restrained, so you have disadvantage. I still count it as disadvantage just because it's more like he's trying to see if he can do the proper, like, hand motions and such to actually cast the spell. Or with, like, enough force to even, like, hurt the creature. So he's trying to cast Chromatic Orb with fire damage. I feel like Burning Hands might have been a bit more reliable. But with disadvantage, he rolls like an 11, a 15, and then uses luck and rolls like a 12. He proceeds to use all 3 of his luck points to get this attack to hit. It does do enough damage to force the con save, but the worm rolls like a natural 19 and that passes the flying colors. So unfortunately, it's not enough to expel him. But then with it taking damage, it is no longer charmed. So back to combat. At some point, Umric also gets swallowed. Basil, I swear, rolled the luckiest deck. They rolled some lucky deck saves. At one point, I was worried that the worm is just going to eat everybody, because according to the monster stat block, there is no limit as to how many creatures the worm can eat, which makes sense, because if it's like a 30, 40, 50 foot long worm, like, you could just fit a lot of people down there, right? So I was like, oh god, if you guys don't, like, do something soon, you're all gonna get eaten. But luckily, they made a lot of their saves. I think Basil himself made like 3-4 saves or something like that. Umric made a few before he was actually eaten. And then, in the end, it was Beverin, our rogue, who got the final hit. He got a really good sneak attack on it, and once the worm is dead, they were able to kind of get Umric and Ivar out. Ivar was unconscious, by the way, inside the worm, which could have been really bad as well. But eventually they get all healed up and decide to take a short rest here. Now, this worm and their fighting has not been quiet. The worm has been shrieking this whole time, and probably attracting other creatures that might be in the area. You might argue that a worm shrieking might, scare things away, but I mean, monsters are always looking for, sources of easy food, things to scavenge, so they try to take a short rest. I gave them a prayer of healing. And as one character is rolling hit dice, I'm like, hang on. Roll perception. And they start to notice that there are sounds of like low growling that's kind of getting closer. So they tear down like the tunnel that they had gone through to get to this cavern. When they get back to kind of that intersection where there's like the V and like the little branching path off, they both hear this crash coming from the center tunnel a little ways down as something large seems to kind of break through the ice. And they roll a stealth check. Don't roll very well. I think somebody rolls a natural 1, so it notices them. So Beverin quickly casts Rope Trick. They all get up the rope. Tyrell, who is last, I think he rolled the 1. He sees this like large blue reptilian, like lizard-like a creature, kind of a scuttle out of the cave. These are frost salamanders. Scuttle out of the tunnel and attempt to bite him as he's climbing up. Luckily, he does manage to get up the rope, and they take a short rest unhindered by any other creatures. So now they're talking strategy, which I kind of wish they would do before the big encounters. But because they're kind of fixated on the wall that's possibly breakable, if only they had a giant worm to break through it. Or they also come up with the idea that maybe Puck can summon the Balgura and wail on the wall to break it open, which can also work. It'll take longer than a large worm, and it might attract some noise. But after their short rest, they kind of head back down the tunnel to see what's going on. Beverin's familiar does some scouting down kind of the fork this way to the southeast, and just finds more tunnel. Up ahead, they do realize that there are sounds of flesh tearing and what sounds like a carcass being eaten, and similarly, like 20-30 feet from the tunnel, they can see that around the corpse of this giant frostworm are now several of those salamander-like creatures who appear to be in the middle of a meal. So we kind of left it there so that I'm giving them some time to discuss how they want to approach this. Hazel's like little tingle check, basically, when they're in the cavern, is pulling them kind of straight through that northern wall, which is probably why they want to go through it as, path of, well, it's not really the path of least resistance because there's a wall, but it's the most direct path that they can probably foresee. And with the tunnels, even though they do have a direction, it's much harder to gauge what path is the correct one, and I don't think they want to encounter too many more things. They mentioned that, okay, anything else from now on, we just run. And while I agree with that, I still can't help but think that maybe they should have run from the worm because they had the chance to. Future encounters, like, you don't always have the option to run, or if things surprise you, you still are going to take some pain. And they still got the orb. They were thinking that like maybe the orb's not protected since it's already like so deep in these like caverns with monsters guarding it. But that's not how it works. So that's why we left it, and I guess I will see what my players want to do. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for notifications when I put out new videos. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!